You should have kept loving me from a distance. His voice was low, controlled. The kind that didn't need to be loud to be obeyed. And I remember the exact way my breath caught in my throat when he said it, like the air itself had decided to betray me. Because the truth was, I had loved him from a distance. 4 years. Quietly. Carefully. Like something fragile I couldn't afford to break. And now, there was nowhere left to hide. It didn't start that night though. It started long before that. In rooms where I didn't belong. Under lights too bright for someone like me. Standing at the edge of conversations I was never invited into. Watching him move through people like gravity pulled everything toward him. Dominic Russo didn't walk into a room. He took it. Every inch of it. Every breath. Every pair of eyes. And I was just there. Another face in the background. Another employee with a name nobody important needed to remember. Except he did remember things. I noticed that early on. The way he'd recall details others missed. The way nothing escaped him. Which made it even stranger that, for the longest time, I believed I was invisible to him. Maybe that's why it was safe to love him. Because loving someone who doesn't see you feels like standing behind glass. You can watch. You can feel. But you never risk being touched. And I told myself that was enough. That it had to be enough. I would catch glimpses of him in passing. The subtle nods people gave before he even spoke. The quiet shift in the room when he entered, like everyone adjusted without realizing it. And sometimes, just sometimes, his eyes would pass over me. Not stopping. Not lingering. Just a flicker. And I would carry that moment with me longer than I should have. Replaying it like it meant something. Like maybe one day it would mean something. I built entire stories out of seconds. Out of nothing. Because it was safer than wanting more. Safer than stepping closer to a world I knew wasn't built for someone like me. But then there were moments that didn't fit the rules I'd created. Moments that cracked the illusion just enough to let doubt in. Like the night he said my name. Without looking at a file. Without asking. Just said it like he already knew it. Olivia. Calm. Certain. Like it had always been his to say. And I remember freezing. Because people like him don't notice people like me. Except, he had. And that was the first mistake. Not his. Mine. Because I didn't step back. I didn't rebuild the distance I'd spent years protecting. I let myself believe that maybe being seen wasn't as dangerous as I thought. That maybe it didn't change anything. But it changed everything. I started noticing the way his attention shifted. Subtle at first. Almost impossible to prove. A glance that lingered half a second too long. A question directed at me instead of someone more important. The quiet way he would appear wherever I was. Never obvious. Never careless. Just enough to make me wonder if it was coincidence or something else entirely. And that question followed me. Sat with me. Kept me awake longer than it should have. Because if it wasn't coincidence, then it meant I wasn't invisible anymore. And if I wasn't invisible, then I was exposed. And being exposed in his world wasn't safe. I should have pulled away then. I should have remembered the rules. But I didn't. Because a part of me, the part that had loved him in silence for so long, wanted to know what it felt like to be chosen. Even if it was just for a moment. Even if it was a mistake. And that was the second mistake. Thinking I would recognize the moment things changed. Thinking there would be a clear line between before and after. There wasn't. It was gradual. Quiet. Like everything else about him. Until suddenly, it wasn't. Until suddenly I was standing too close. Breathing too fast. With nowhere left to step back to. And his presence wasn't distant anymore. It was right there. Overwhelming. Undeniable. And for the first time, I realized something I should have understood from the beginning. People like Dominic Russo don't notice something, without deciding what to do with it. And that night, when he finally looked at me like I wasn't just part of the background, like I was something else entirely, I knew. I was no longer watching his world from a distance. I was already inside it. The first time he called me into his office, it was not dramatic. Not loud. Not anything like the scenes people imagine when they think about men like him. It was quiet. Almost casual. Like it meant nothing. And somehow, that made it worse. Because nothing about Dominic Russo was ever casual. Not really. I remember standing outside the door for a full 10 seconds. Staring at the handle like it might give me an answer. Like it might tell me why me. Why now? Because people like him do not make random choices. And I knew that. Everyone knew that. Which meant this was not random. Which meant I had already crossed a line I did not even see. I knocked. Soft. Controlled. The way you do when you are trying not to draw attention to yourself. And his voice came from inside. Steady. Calm. Come in. And just hearing it sent something sharp through my chest. Because it was different when it was directed at me. Not across a room. Not filtered through distance. But right at me. I stepped inside. And the space felt exactly like him. Precise. Ordered. Every detail intentional. Dark wood. Clean lines. A city view stretching out in perfect silence behind him. Like even the skyline knew better than to interrupt. He did not look up right away. Which somehow made it harder to breathe. Because it gave me time to notice everything. The way he sat. The way his hands rested on the desk. Still. Controlled. Like nothing about him ever moved without permission. And then finally, he lifted his eyes. And that was it. That was the moment everything shifted again. Because this time, he did not just look at me. He held the look. Steady. Measuring. Like he was deciding something. Like he had already been deciding it for a while. Close the door, Olivia, he said. And I felt it in the way my name left his mouth. Not unfamiliar anymore. Not accidental. Like it belonged in that space. I turned. Closed the door. And the soft click behind me sounded louder than it should have. Like something final. Like a boundary sealing itself shut. I stayed near the door at first. Instinct. Distance. But he noticed. Of course he noticed. He always noticed. Come closer, he added. Not raising his voice. Not needing to. And I hesitated for half a second before moving. Because hesitation feels like resistance in a room like that. And I was not sure resistance was something I was allowed. Each step felt deliberate. Like I was walking into something I could not step out of later. I stopped a few feet from his desk. Close enough to feel the weight of his attention. But not close enough to forget where I stood. Or where he stood. You have been working here for 3 years, he said. Not a question. And I nodded. Because correcting him would have been pointless even if he was wrong. But he was not wrong. He never was. Yes, I answered. My voice quieter than I intended. And he leaned back slightly. Studying me in that same unsettling way. Like he was reading something written under the surface. And before that, he continued, you interned here for 6 months. My breath caught. Just for a second. Because that was not something most people would know. Not something that mattered enough to remember. Unless you were looking for it. Unless you had been paying attention long before I realized. Yes, I said again. And the silence that followed stretched. Not empty. Never empty with him. Filled with something unspoken. something that made it harder to stand still. "You are careful," he said finally. And I did not know if it was a compliment or a warning. "You stay out of things that do not concern you." His gaze sharpened just slightly. Enough for me to feel it. "That is why I am curious." And there it was. The shift. Subtle. But undeniable. Curiosity from a man like him was not harmless. It was not idle. It meant attention. And attention meant consequence. I forced myself to hold his gaze. Even though every instinct told me to look away. Because looking away felt like admitting something. And I did not even know what that something was yet. "Curious about what?" I asked. And for a brief second, something almost like amusement flickered in his expression. Not warmth. Not kindness. Just interest. "About why someone who has spent years staying invisible," he said slowly, each word deliberate, suddenly stopped. My heart skipped. Hard enough that I was sure he could hear it. Because he was not guessing. He was not reaching. He knew. Somehow, he knew that something had changed. That I had crossed a line I did not even recognize at the time. And that realization settled heavy in my chest. Because it meant this was never about one moment. Never about one mistake. It meant he had been watching long enough to notice the difference. Long enough to decide it mattered. And when Dominic Russo decided something mattered, it did not go back to being nothing. His words did not leave room for denial. Not the kind that could survive more than a second under his gaze. And I felt it immediately. The pressure of being seen too clearly. Like every careful step I had taken over the years had been mapped out without my permission. And now he was standing at the center of it. Waiting for me to admit something I had never said out loud. I swallowed. Forcing my voice to stay steady, even though nothing inside me felt steady anymore. "I did not stop," I said. And it was the truth. At least the part of it I was willing to give him. Because I had not suddenly changed. I had just slipped. Just once. Just enough for him to notice. But with him, once was enough. Always enough. His eyes did not move from mine. Not even slightly. Like he was measuring the space between what I said and what I meant. And I realized too late that answering him at all had already given him more than silence ever would have. "No," he said quietly. Almost thoughtfully. "You did." And there was no argument in his tone. No room for debate. Just certainty. The kind that made my chest tighten. Because I did not know how to push back against something so absolute. 3 nights ago," he continued. And my breath caught before I could stop it. Because I knew exactly what he was referring to. Even before he finished. Even before he had to explain. "You stayed late," he said. His voice even. Controlled. "Later than you needed to." My mind replayed it instantly. The empty office floor. The dim lights. The quiet hum of the city outside the windows. I had told myself I was finishing work. Catching up. Being responsible. But that was not why I stayed. Not really. I stayed because I knew he would still be there. Because there was a part of me that wanted to exist in the same space as him. Without the noise of everyone else. Without the distance. And I had thought it was harmless. Invisible. Just like everything else I had done for years. I had been wrong. "You were not working," he added. Softer this time. And the way he said it felt almost personal. Like he was not accusing me. Just stating something he had already accepted as fact. I opened my mouth. Then closed it again. Because explaining it would only make it worse. Would turn something quiet into something real. And real things in his world had consequences. I forced myself to meet his eyes again. Even though it felt like standing too close to something I could not control. "I finished what I needed to do," I said carefully. choosing each word like it mattered. Because it did. Every word mattered here. And for a second, the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. Just the smallest acknowledgement that I was still trying to stay within the lines. Still trying to protect something that was already exposed. You watched, he said. And that was it. That was the line I could not step back from. Because he was right. I had. Not in a way that meant harm. Not in a way that crossed any obvious boundary. But I had stayed. I had looked. I had allowed myself that one moment of closeness I had denied for years. And now he was holding it up like evidence. Like proof that I was no longer as careful as I thought. My heart beat faster. Not loud. Not frantic. Just enough to remind me that I was standing in front of someone who noticed everything. I did not mean anything by it, I said. And I hated how small that sounded. How insufficient it felt the second it left my mouth. Because meaning did not matter here. Intention did not erase attention. And attention was what changed everything. He leaned forward slightly then. Just enough to shift the space between us. Not closing it. But making me aware of how little space there actually was. That is the problem, he said. His voice lower now. Not louder. Just closer. Like it belonged in the air between us. You think this is about what you meant. My fingers tightened slightly at my sides. A small, unconscious reaction I could not hide. And I saw his eyes drop for a fraction of a second. Catching it. Registering it. Adding it to whatever calculation was already running behind that steady expression. It is not, he continued. And there was something final in the way he said it. Something that settled heavy in my chest. It is about what you did. Silence followed. Thick. Deliberate. And I realized in that moment that this was not an interrogation. Not really. He was not trying to figure something out. He already had. This was something else. Something more controlled. More intentional. Like he was guiding me toward a realization I had been avoiding. And the worst part was, I was already there. I already understood what he was saying without him needing to say it directly. That the distance I had relied on. The silence I had hidden behind. It was gone now. Replaced by something real. Something visible. Something he could reach. And once something was within his reach, it did not go back to being out of it. I should have said something then, something clear, something that drew a line between his world and mine before it blurred any further, but the truth was I did not know where that line was anymore, not after the way he was looking at me, not after the way he had already stepped past it without asking, and maybe that was the part that unsettled me the most, not that he had noticed, but that he had decided it mattered, because when someone like Dominic Russo decides something matters, it does. Not stay small, it does not stay contained, it becomes something else entirely. I can make sure it does not happen again, I said finally, and the second the words left my mouth, I knew they were wrong, not because they were untrue, but because they were irrelevant. His gaze did not shift, did not soften, it just stayed there, steady, like he was waiting for me to understand something I was still trying to avoid. That is not what I asked, he replied, and his voice was not sharp, not raised. Just precise, cutting through everything I had tried to put between us. I felt the weight of that, the way he redirected the moment without effort, without giving me room to retreat back into something safe. Then what are you asking? I said, quieter now, not out of fear exactly, but because the room itself felt smaller, like the air had changed, like every word mattered more than it should. He stood then, and that alone shifted everything, because sitting, he had been controlled, contained behind the desk, but standing, he took up space in a way that made it impossible to ignore the difference. Between us, the distance that had always protected me suddenly felt too thin, too fragile. He moved around the desk slowly, not rushed, not aggressive, just deliberate, like every step had already been decided before he took it, and I stayed where I was, even though every instinct told me to step back, to create distance, to rebuild something I had already lost, but moving would have meant admitting I felt it. Admitting that he affected me in a way I could not explain, and I was not ready to give him that, not yet. He stopped a few feet in front of me, closer than before, close enough that I could feel the shift in the space between us, not physical, not tangible, but real in a way that made my breath slow, my thoughts narrow. "I am asking," he said, his voice lower now, not louder, just closer, "why you stayed." And there it was again, not the action, not the fact that I had been there, but the reason behind it, the one thing I could not give him without giving him everything else. I looked at him, really looked this time, at the calm certainty in his expression, at the way he already seemed to know more than I had said, and for a second, I considered telling him the truth, just to see what would happen, just to see if it would change anything, but the truth was not safe, not in a room like this, not with someone like him. "It does not matter," I answered instead, and the moment stretched, quiet, tense, and I knew he heard what I did not say just as clearly as what I did. His eyes held mine for a long second, and then something shifted, not in a way that was obvious, not something anyone else would have noticed, but I felt it. The change in his focus, the way his attention sharpened, narrowed, like he had reached a conclusion, like he was done asking and ready to decide. "It matters," he said simply, and there was no room left in his tone, no space for argument, just finality, and I felt something settle in my chest at that, something heavy and unavoidable, because I realized then that this was never about understanding me, not really. It was about defining something, naming it, turning it into something that belonged to him instead of something I could keep hidden. And once something was defined in his world, it did not stay uncertain, it did not stay free, it became fixed, controlled, part of a system I did not understand, and the worst part was not that he was doing it, the worst part was that I had given him the opening without realizing it. I had stepped out of the silence I had hidden in for years, just once, and now that silence was gone, replaced by something louder, something visible. Something he could reach, and standing there, with him just a few feet away, looking at me like I was no longer just another name on a list, I understood something I had been avoiding since the moment I walked into that office. This was not a conversation I could walk away from the same way I had walked in, because whatever he had decided about me, whatever he had seen, it had already changed the balance between us, and there was no going back to being invisible again. I felt it before he even spoke again, that shift in the air when a decision has already been made and the conversation is just catching up to it, and it made something in my chest tighten because I knew, without knowing how, that whatever came next was not something I could redirect or soften. "You are trying to control the outcome," he said, almost thoughtfully, like he was observing a pattern instead of confronting a person, and I realized then that every careful answer I had given him, every attempt to stay neutral, to stay small, it had all been visible to him from the start. Not impressive, not subtle, just predictable. "I am trying to do my job," I replied, and it sounded weaker than I intended, not because it was untrue, but because it was incomplete, and he knew it, of course he knew it. His eyes did not leave mine, not even for a second, like he was waiting for the rest of it, the part one refused to say, the part one had refused to say for years. "No," he said quietly, and the way he said it made my pulse stutter, not from fear, but from the certainty in it. "You are trying to disappear again." The words landed heavier than anything else he had said, because they were not about the moment, not about that night, or that office or what I had seen. They were about me, about the pattern I had built my entire life around, and hearing it said out loud, hearing him name it so easily, made it impossible to ignore. I opened my mouth to respond, to deny it, to reshape it into something less exposed, but nothing came out, because denying it would have been a lie. And something told me he would hear that just as clearly as the truth. The silence stretched. Not empty, never empty, filled with something that felt dangerously close to understanding, and that was worse than anything else, because understanding meant he was not just noticing me, he was reading me. "Look at me," he said then, softer this time, not an order exactly, but not a request either, something in between that carried more weight than either one, and I realized I had looked away without meaning to. My gaze dropping somewhere between us like that would create distance that did not exist. I lifted my eyes back to his, slowly, aware of every inch of space between us, aware of how close he was now, closer than before, close enough that the details were sharper, clearer, impossible to ignore. "You stayed," he repeated, not questioning it this time, just anchoring it, making it something solid, something that could not be undone, and you watched. His voice lowered slightly, not in volume, but in tone, like the words themselves carried more weight now. People do not do that without a reason. My heart beat faster at that, not frantic, just steady and undeniable, like it was answering him even when I refused to. You want me to explain something that does not change anything, I said, and this time my voice held a little more strength, not defiance, but something close to it, because if I gave him the reason, if I gave him the truth, it would not fix anything, it would not undo what had already happened, it would just make it real in a way I could not take back. He studied me for a moment, longer this time, and there was something different in his expression now, not softer, not kinder, just more focused, like he had moved past curiosity into something more deliberate. It changes everything, he said, and I felt that settle into the space between us, heavy and final, because I understood then that this was not about facts, not about what I had done or not done, it was about ownership of the moment, about defining it in a way that gave him control over it, over me, over whatever this had become. I took a small breath, steadying myself, because I could feel the edge of something here, something I had been avoiding stepping into. And if I do not explain it, I asked, my voice quieter now, not because I was unsure, but because the question itself felt too large for anything louder. His gaze did not waver, did not soften, it just held mine with that same calm intensity. Then I decide, he said simply, and that was it, no elaboration, no threat, just a statement of fact that landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because it was not about forcing me, it was about removing the illusion that I had a choice in how this ended, and standing there, with him so close, with his attention fixed entirely on me in a way I had once thought I wanted, I realized something I should have understood from the beginning. Wanting to be seen and being seen by someone like him were not the same thing, not even close, because once he saw something, once he decided it mattered, it did not stay undefined, it did not stay mine to control, it became his to interpret, his to shape, his to keep, and the silence I had lived in for years, the distance that had protected me, it was gone now. Replaced by something I could not step away from no matter how carefully I tried. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him, not the words, but the weight behind them, because there was something too calm about the way he said it, something too certain, like the outcome had already been decided and I was just now catching up to it. You decide, I repeated quietly, not as a challenge, not even as a question, just to hear it out loud, to make it real in a way that might give me something to push against. But he did not correct me, did not soften it. He just held my gaze with that same steady focus that made it impossible to pretend this was anything less than what it was, and I felt it then, the shift inside me, small but undeniable, the instinct to step back, to reclaim even a fraction of the distance I had lost, because standing this close, under that kind of attention, felt like standing in a place where every part of me was being weighed, measured, defined. I took a small step back before I could stop myself, not dramatic, not sudden. Just enough to create space, just enough to remind myself that I was still capable of moving, still capable of choosing something, anything, but even that small movement did not go unnoticed, nothing ever did with him. His eyes followed it, not sharply, not in a way that called it out, just registering it, adding it to whatever silent calculation he had already made. You are doing it again, he said, and there was something almost quiet in his tone, not accusing, just stating. And I knew exactly what he meant. Even before he finished, creating distance, the words settled between us, simple, direct, impossible to argue with because they were true. I forced myself to stop moving, to hold my ground even though everything in me was telling me to keep stepping back until I found the version of this room where I was still invisible. I am standing where I should be, I replied, and this time there was something firmer in my voice, something that felt closer to control. Because if I could not change the situation, then I could at least control how I stood in it. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something sharper, more focused, like he had been waiting for that, waiting for me to push back in even the smallest way. There is no should here, he said, and the way he said it made something in my chest tighten again, because it removed the structure I had been holding on to. The idea that there were rules, boundaries, rules that defined where I stood and where he stood. Only what is, he added, and I realized then that this was not just about me, not just about what I had done or not done, it was about the space between us, about how he saw it, how he defined it, and how easily he could shift it without asking. I held his gaze. Not because it was easy, but because looking away felt like giving him more than I already had. And what is that? I asked, quieter now, but steady, because if he was going to define this, I needed to hear it, needed to understand what he thought he had seen, what he thought this was. The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, more deliberate, like he was choosing his words with the same precision he used for everything else, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, not softer, just closer, like it belonged to the space between us more than the room itself. You stepped into something you do not understand, he said, and there was no judgment in it, no warning, just a statement that felt heavier than both, because it implied there was more, something beyond what I had seen, beyond what I thought I knew, and now you are trying to step out of it. His eyes did not leave mine, not even for a second, and I felt the weight of that, the way it held me in place. Without touching me, but that is not how this works. Something in my chest tightened at that, not fear exactly, but recognition, because I understood what he was saying even if he had not said it directly, that this was not a moment I could undo, not a mistake I could quietly correct and move past. It was something that had already been noticed, already been defined in his world. And things defined in his world did not disappear. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, because I could feel the edge of something again, something that felt like a choice even if it was not really one. You are making this sound like I crossed a line, I said, and the words felt heavier than I intended, because saying them out loud made the idea real, made the possibility of it unavoidable. His gaze sharpened just slightly at that, not in surprise, just in acknowledgement, like I had finally reached the point he had been guiding me toward. You did, he said simply, and there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just that same calm certainty that made it impossible to dismiss, impossible to ignore, and for the first time since I walked into that office, I felt it fully, the realization settling in a way that could not be undone, that this was not about what I thought mattered, not about my intentions or my reasons or the years I had spent staying careful. It was about what he had seen, what he had decided, and the fact that once he decided something, it did not go back to being undefined, it became something real, something fixed, something that I could not step away from no matter how carefully I tried. And standing there, with him just a few feet away, looking at me like I was no longer something distant or optional, I understood something I had been avoiding from the very beginning. Crossing that line had not been the moment I stayed late, it had been the moment he noticed I did. The words lingered between us, heavier than anything else he had said, and I could feel the shift they carried, not loud, not sudden, but undeniable, like something had quietly crossed a point where it could not return, and I stood there, aware of every detail, the way the light from the window traced the edge of his suit, the stillness in his posture, the precision in the way he held my gaze without blinking, without wavering, like he was not just looking at me, but deciding something about me. Something final. You think this is about one moment, he said, his voice low, controlled, and I felt it immediately, the way he cut through the idea I had been holding on to, the belief that everything could still be contained, reduced, explained away. I shook my head slightly, not fully denying it, but not accepting it either, because I needed there to be a version of this that stayed small, something I could step away from. Once I walked out of this room, it was one moment, I replied, and my voice held, steady but thin, stretched between truth and restraint. His expression did not change, but there was a shift in his eyes, something sharper, more focused, like he had reached the part of the conversation he had been guiding me toward from the beginning. No, he said quietly, and the certainty in it made my breath slow. It was years. The words settled into the space between us, heavier than anything before. Because they reached further back than I wanted them to, further back than I had ever allowed anyone to see. My chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from recognition, because he was not wrong, not entirely, and that made it impossible to dismiss, impossible to push aside. You watched, he continued, his voice still calm, still measured, you stayed close without stepping in, and I felt something shift inside me at that, something I had kept buried under routine, under silence, under distance. People do not do that without meaning something by it, he added, and there it was again, the question beneath everything, not what I did, but why, always why. I held his gaze, even though it felt like standing in a place where nothing about me was hidden anymore. You are assuming intent, I said, quieter now, but still holding on to the last piece of control I had. because if I let him define that, if I let him name it, then it would no longer be something I could keep to myself. His eyes did not soften, did not shift, they just stayed on mine with that same steady focus, like he had already moved past doubt, past possibility, into certainty. I am recognizing it, he said, and the weight of that settled into the room, final, deliberate, leaving no space for denial that could actually hold. I felt my breath catch, just for a second, because I understood then that this was not something I could argue out of existence, not something I could reduce or reshape. It was something he had already seen clearly, already decided was real, and standing there, with him just a few feet away, I realized something I had avoided since the moment this conversation began. This was not about whether I admitted the truth, it was about the fact that he had already accepted it as fact, and once he did that, it no longer belonged to me alone. The silence settled differently this time, not uncertain, not fragile, but heavy with something already decided, and I felt it in the way he looked at me, like there was no longer a question left between us, only the outcome, only the shift I could not undo. I drew in a slow breath, steadying myself, but it did nothing to ease the tension tightening in my chest, because the truth was already there, already seen, already understood without being spoken. You are waiting for me to say it, I said. Quietly, and even to my own ears it sounded less like a challenge and more like an acknowledgement. His gaze did not move, did not soften, it only held mine with that same calm intensity that made everything feel closer than it should. No, he replied, his voice low, controlled, I am waiting for you to stop pretending, and something in me stilled at that, not because I did not understand, but because I did, completely. I looked at him, really looked this time, at the certainty in his expression, at the way he stood without hesitation, like there had never been a doubt in his mind about what this was, or what it meant, and for a second, I felt the urge to step back again, to reclaim even a fraction of the distance I had lost, but I did not move, because moving would have meant denying something I could no longer deny. And if I do not, I asked, softer now, the words barely above a breath. His eyes sharpened just slightly, not in warning, but in confirmation, like I had reached the only point that mattered, and when he answered, there was no pause, no hesitation, just certainty. Then it does not change anything, he said, and the weight of that settled into the space between us, final and undeniable, because it meant this was no longer about what I said or did, it was about what he had already decided. And standing there, with no distance left to hide behind, I realized something I should have understood from the beginning. Once he chose to see me, there was no going back to being unseen. The space between us felt smaller than it should have, like something invisible had closed in without either of us moving, and I stood there, aware that whatever this had become, it was no longer something I could step out of by choice alone. I drew in a slow breath, steady but shallow, because even that felt different now, like the air itself had shifted around us. So that is it, I said quietly, not a question, not really, just a recognition of what had already settled into place. His gaze held mine, unwavering, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, only that same calm certainty that had been there from the beginning. That is it, he answered, and the simplicity of it made it final in a way nothing else could have. I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, not exactly, but something deeper, something that came with understanding, a moment you could not undo. I looked at him, really looked, at the way he stood, composed, controlled, like nothing about this was unexpected to him, like he had known from the start where this would lead, and maybe that was the truth I had been avoiding all